It doesn't happen the way most people imagine it will, in the version most people carry, the version that hope constructs, in the quiet moments when the mind drifts toward what justice might look like in this particular situation. The realization arrives dramatically, a moment of clarity so complete and so undeniable that it produces immediate, visible, unambiguous change. The avoidance sits somewhere, and something shifts, and they know with the sudden completeness of genuine revelation what they had and what they lost and what the losing cost them. And the knowing produces action, produces the reaching out, the honesty, the finally said things that were always present beneath the architecture and never allowed to surface, produces the transformation that the connection always had the potential to produce, but never quite managed to reach while the relationship was active. That is not how it happens. The realization is not a moment. It is a process, a slow, often painful, frequently interrupted, non-linear process that moves through the avoidance interior with the specific pace and specific texture of all genuinely significant psychological change, which is to say, slowly, incompletely, and with many periods where the progress seems to have reversed entirely before the next increment of genuine development becomes available. The realization happens in layers. Each layer reveals another layer beneath it, and the complete realization, the full unmediated architecture-penetrating understanding of what losing you actually feels like, is not available all at once. It is assembled, piece by piece, through the specific experiences that the absence provides, and that the presence, because the presence was always something the architecture was managing against, could never fully produce. The first layer of the realization arrives in the form of a subtraction that the avoidant cannot immediately source. In the days and weeks following the point at which your departure became real, not the moment of the ending, necessarily, but the moment at which the avoidance system registered the ending as genuine rather than provisional. Something in the texture of daily experience changes in a way that the management is slow to account for. Things that were previously reliable sources of satisfaction become slightly less satisfying. Not dramatically, not in the way that would announce itself as grief or loss or the specific consequence of a significant departure, but measurably. The food is slightly less interesting. The work is slightly less engaging. The conversations with other people have a quality of almost arriving at something and then not quite getting there that wasn't characteristic of them before. The management system, running its standard assessment, attributes the subtraction to external factors, to work stress, to seasonal changes, to the ordinary fluctuation of mood that everyone experiences and that doesn't require deeper investigation. The attribution is almost convincing. It has the surface plausibility of any explanation that is partially correct. The external factors the management invokes are real. They are present. They are legitimately influencing the avoidance experience. What the management doesn't account for is that the specific quality of the subtraction doesn't track with those external factors in the way it should if they were actually the primary cause. The work stress fluctuates, and the subtraction doesn't correspondingly reduce. The season changes, and the quality remains consistent. The ordinary mood variation resolves, and the underlying flatness persists. The subtraction persists because its source is not external. Its source is the specific, irreplaceable frequency that your presence was generating in the avoidance experiential life. A frequency that neither of them fully registered while it was present, because the architecture was always managing the registration downward, keeping the avoidant from fully acknowledging the degree to which your presence was contributing to the quality of their experience. The acknowledgement was dangerous. It would have constituted an admission of need, and need, in the avoidant psychological economy, was the thing the architecture was most comprehensively designed to prevent from being admitted. The absence is making the admission unavoidable, not through argument, not through the avoidant deciding to acknowledge, the contribution, through the specific, experiential, impossible to deny evidence of what the experience feels like without it. The second layer arrives through comparison, not the deliberate, conscious comparison of you against other people or other experiences, but the involuntary, automatic comparison that the nervous system runs whenever something in the current environment approaches the territory that your presence occupied. A conversation that gets interesting and then levels off before it reaches the specific quality of depth that conversations with you consistently reached. A moment of genuine connection with someone new that has warmth and authenticity and is genuinely valuable, and still, somehow, lacks something that the avoidance system identifies with an accuracy that is uncomfortable in its specificity. It lacks you, not generically, specifically, the specific quality of being understood in the particular way you understood, the specific texture of a dynamic in which the other person was responding to what was actually present in the avoidant, rather than to the managed presentation of it. This comparison runs without being invited and without being welcomed. The avoidant does not want to be making it. The comparison interferes with genuine engagement with what is present. It introduces the ghost of what was present into every new context that approaches similar territory, and the ghost is not flattering to the current context. And the current context deserves better than to be perpetually measured against an absent standard. The avoidant knows this, knows the comparison is neither fair nor useful, and continues to run it anyway, because the nervous system's assessments are not subject to the management's preferences about what should be assessed and what should be left alone. What the comparison is doing, beneath the immediate experience of it as inconvenient interference, is building the evidence base for the realization. Each comparison adds a piece of evidence to the case that is being constructed in the avoidance interior against the foundational assumption that what was lost was substitutable. Each moment of almost but not quite confirms, with the patient efficiency of accumulating data, that the specific quality of what existed with you is not a generic quality available in sufficient approximation from other sources. It was specific to you, to the specific combination of your attunement, your patience, your quality of presence, your particular way of being in genuine exchange with another person. And the specificity is precisely what makes the loss irreplaceable. Not the loss of connection in general. The avoidant can find connection in general. The loss of this specific connection with this specific person, whose specific irreplaceability the comparisons keep confirming with every failed approximation. The third layer is the one that tends to arrive in the small, unguarded moments that the management doesn't have advance warning to prepare for. It arrives in the gap between the end of one thing and the beginning of the next, in the particular quality of a Sunday afternoon that has no structure to fill it and no distraction immediately available to fill the structure, in the specific silence of a space that used to have your presence in it, or that the avoidant would have shared with you if the dynamic had developed differently, or that simply has the quality of being a space in which your absence is more present than your absence should be in a life that was supposedly fine without you. In these moments, something surfaces that is not the ambient subtraction of the first layer and not the comparative dissatisfaction of the second layer. It is more specific than either. It has the quality of being oriented towards something, of being a feeling that knows what it is about, even if the avoidance management is working to prevent the knowing from fully articulating itself. It is grief, not the generic grief of loss, but the specific grief of losing a specific person, whose specific significance the management cannot, in these unguarded moments, successfully minimize. The grief in these moments has a texture that the avoidant finds genuinely surprising, even alarming, because the architecture was supposed to have prevented this. The whole purpose of the deactivating strategies, the fault finding, the retrospective flattening, the elevation of alternatives, was to ensure that the significance of any connection was reduced to a level that made this specific quality of grief unavailable, unearnable by the loss, because the loss was never allowed to be of something of sufficient significance to produce it. And here the grief is anyway, specific and oriented and clearly about you in a way that the management's attempts to attribute it to other things keep failing to sustain. The grief in these moments is the avoidance system refusing for the first time to allow the management to complete its work. The architecture ran the deactivating strategies, and the significance was reduced at the cognitive level. The story was constructed, the fault finding was generated, the retrospective flattening was attempted, and something at a deeper level simply didn't cooperate. Continued encoding the significance at its actual level, regardless of the cognitive management happening above it. Continued registering you as the genuinely irreplaceably significant person you were, regardless of what the story being constructed about you was saying. And in the unguarded moments, the deeper level gets heard. The fourth layer is what could be called the arrival of honest accounting, the moment, or more accurately, the series of moments, because this layer too arrives incrementally, at which the avoidance relationship to the causality of the loss shifts from the externalized managed version to something more accurate and more confrontational. The externalized version, which was always the management's preferred account, distributed the cause of the loss across a range of factors that minimized the avoidant's own role in producing it. The relationship was complicated, the timing was difficult, the compatibility had genuine limits. These elements were real enough to function as partial explanations, and partial explanations were all the management needed. Enough truth to make the story plausible, enough external attribution to keep the internal source of the loss from requiring direct examination. The honest accounting begins when the partial explanations start failing to fully account for the specific, persistent, grief-generating quality of what is being experienced in the absence. Because if the relationship was genuinely too complicated, if the incompatibility was genuinely the primary explanation for the ending, the absence should feel more like relief than like the specific-oriented, U-shaped grief that the unguarded moments keep producing, the relief of a situation resolved rather than the grief of something lost. And the felt experience is grief, unambiguously, specifically about you grief, which is not consistent with the relationship having been primarily a complication, which is consistent with the relationship having been primarily a connection, a genuine, significant, irreplaceable connection that the avoidance fear produced the loss of. The honest accounting doesn't complete in a single session. It arrives through the repeated failure of the externalized version to account for what is actually being experienced. Each time the management reaches for the partial explanation, and the partial explanation doesn't quite fit the felt reality, the space between the explanation and the experience widens. And in the widening space, the more accurate account begins to form. Not comfortably, not without significant resistance from the architecture, which has a strong investment in the externalized version remaining sufficient, but with the steady, inexorable pressure of a reality that is too persistently present to be permanently denied. The fifth layer is the realization proper, the full, finally, unmediated, architecture-penetrating understanding of what losing you specifically feels like. Not the ambient subtraction, not the comparative dissatisfaction, not the unguarded grief or the honest accounting, but all of it, simultaneously, recognized for what it collectively constitutes. The avoidance sits in whatever specific moment finally carries sufficient accumulated weight to produce the recognition, and something in the interior acknowledges what has been present for however long the absence has lasted. This is what it feels like to have lost the specific irreplaceable person who saw what was actually there and stayed anyway, who understood the fear without becoming its victim, who brought a quality of genuine presence to the connection that the management kept trying to reduce to a manageable size, and that kept rising back to its actual size regardless of the managing. Who was the specific, unprecedented experience of being genuinely known by another person in a way that the architecture was constructed to prevent from ever happening, and that happened anyway. Beneath and alongside and despite the architecture, in the genuine felt reality of what existed between you. This is what that loss feels like the subtraction of a frequency that was always present and is now always absent, like the comparison that keeps running and keeps coming back with the same result, like the unguarded grief that arrives in the structureless moments, like the honest accounting that keeps returning to the same internal source, like all of it, integrated, recognized, no longer manageable as separate and deniable pieces, but assembled into the complete and undeniable picture of what was lost and what it is worth and why the loss is producing what it is producing in the avoidance. Interior, the realization, arriving at this layer, is not comfortable. It is not the relief of finally understanding something. It is the specific, uncomfortable, genuinely confrontational experience of a person who has been maintaining a story about themselves, about their self-sufficiency, about their genuine preference for distance, about the adequacy of the managed version of connection they have been producing across their relational life, and who is now, in the full weight of the realization, unable to maintain the story against the evidence. What the evidence shows is something that the avoidance entire psychology was built to prevent them from having to see. It shows that they needed you, not in the performed, strategically managed way that the architecture permits, the way of needing that stays safely below the threshold of genuine dependence, that can always be attributed to preference rather than to need. That gives the management sufficient deniability to keep the self-sufficient story intact, but actually genuinely, in the specific and profound way that the body knows before the mind admits, and that the morning's pre-management drift confirms, and that the failed comparisons demonstrate, and that the unguarded grief expresses, and that the honest accounting finally acknowledges. They needed the specific quality of your understanding, the specific way you held space for what was defended in them, without requiring it to immediately change. The specific quality of your patience, not the patience of someone who was waiting for them to become different, but the patience of someone who found the person they actually were in their defended and complicated and frequently retreating reality, genuinely worth being present to. They needed the experience of being genuinely known that your attunement produced. They needed the specific, irreplaceable quality of a connection in which something true was regularly occurring between two people, however complicated the context surrounding it, however much the architecture was working against it. The needing was always there. The architecture was never eliminating the need. It was suppressing the acknowledgement of it. And the realization, the full, layered, finally unmediated realization of what losing you feels like, is the acknowledgement finally arriving. Past the suppression, past the architecture's entire sophisticated operation, into the simple, undeniable human reality of a person who needed something genuine and had it and lost it, and is now, in the full weight of that loss, unable to pretend otherwise. What happens after the realization is where the psychology becomes most variable and most consequential, because the realization, however complete and however genuine, does not automatically produce the action that the realization might seem to demand. The knowing and the doing are separated by the same gap that has always existed in the avoidant psychological landscape, the gap between what is genuinely felt and what the architecture permits to be expressed. And that gap, even after the realization, does not close simply because the realization has arrived. What the realization does is change the quality of what is on one side of the gap. Previously, on the feeling side, there was the suppressed and managed and never fully acknowledged love and need and significance. Now there is the fully realized, architecture penetrating, honestly accounted version of all of those things. The feeling is the same. It was always the same, always genuinely present, always the most real thing in the avoidance interior, regardless of what the management was doing to it. But its relationship to the management has changed. It is no longer successfully suppressed. It is present in the foreground. And foreground feelings, in a psychology organized around suppression, create a specific kind of internal pressure that the management was designed for background feelings and is not adequately equipped to handle. That pressure is what eventually produces the behavior change, not immediately, not reliably, not in a form that can be predicted or scheduled, but with the inevitability of pressure that exceeds the container's capacity, the avoidant, who is carrying the full realization, who can no longer suppress the knowledge of what losing you feels like, back to the background where the management can handle it, is carrying something that will eventually produce expression. In what form? Toward what end? With what degree of honesty and what degree of continued architectural interference is the variable that determines what happens next. Some avoidants at this point reach out. The reaching has been described elsewhere in the examination of this dynamic, and everything described there applies here. The reaching is genuine and limited simultaneously. Genuine because it comes from the full weight of the realization. Limited because the architecture, however compromised, is still present, still generating the management response, still ensuring that the expression is smaller than the feeling that is producing it. The casual message that carries enormous unacknowledged weight, the indirect approach that allows the wanting to find expression without requiring the wanting to be named. The reaching that hopes you will close the remaining distance so that the full honesty of what the realization produced doesn't have to be fully expressed in the moment of the reach. What the reaching needs in order to become something more than another iteration of the approach and retreat cycle is response from the genuine, developed, calibrated version of you that the arc of your own becoming has produced. Not the response organized around hoping that the reach is what it might be, the response that is simply and authentically and groundedly you, warm, present, honest, clear about what you require without making the clarity a demand, open to what might be genuinely present without being organized around a specific desired outcome. The response that meets the reach without completing it prematurely, that receives the genuine feeling behind the managed expression without pretending the managed expression is the full story. That holds space for what might be possible without requiring it to be immediately confirmed as probable. Others don't reach out. The realization arrives and is fully felt and produces no external action for reasons that have been examined. The shame, the pride, the uncertainty about what reaching would mean, the genuine self-awareness that the realization alone is not the development that the reconnection would require to be different from what existed before. These avoidants carry the realization privately, and the carrying of it is the beginning of whatever interior work the realization makes possible, the beginning of the confrontation with the pattern, the beginning of the motivation that genuine change requires, the beginning, however tentative and however slow, of the development that might eventually produce a person capable of honoring what they have realized, rather than simply realizing it without being able to yet act from it. For you, in either case, whether the reach comes or whether the realization remains private, the most important thing is what you know, which is this: the realization happened, is happening, will continue to happen in the layered, incremental, architecture-penetrating way that genuine psychological realizations always happen in. The avoidant knows, at whatever level the knowing has currently reached, what losing you feels like. The knowing is real, and it is permanent, and it is the most honest thing their interior has produced in relation to you across the entire arc of what has existed between you. It doesn't require your presence to be real. It doesn't require expression to be genuine. It doesn't require action to have already changed something in the avoidant that no amount of prior experience managed to change. The realization is the change, the first significant foundational change in a psychology that had been, prior to you, successfully resistant to the full cost of its own patterns being felt. You made that change possible by being genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably yourself in the avoidance life, by reaching something that the architecture was built to prevent from being reached, by producing a connection real enough that its loss is finally, completely, architecture dismantlingly felt. The feeling is theirs to navigate. The having been worth feeling is entirely, permanently, irrevocably yours, and it always was. From the very first moment the architecture started working against something it was never, in the end, going to be strong enough to deny. The denying failed in stages. This is worth understanding with some precision, because the staged quality of the failure is what explains the specific timeline of the realization and why it arrives when it does rather than earlier, rather than at the moment the loss was created, rather than in the immediate aftermath when it might have been most useful to you. The denying failed in stages because the architecture was not a single wall but a layered system, multiple overlapping defensive structures, each serving a specific function, each requiring its own specific conditions to fail. And the conditions that failed, the outer layers, were not sufficient to fail the inner ones. The process required time and accumulating evidence and the specific psychological pressure that the absence generated in ways the presence never could. The outermost layer, the cognitive narrative, the story of the relationship that positioned the ending as reasonable and the loss as manageable, and the avoidance role in producing it as minor or justified, failed first. It failed because it required the retrospective flattening of the relationship's warmth to hold, and the warmth refused to be flattened. The memories kept rising with their actual temperature, despite the management's consistent efforts to reduce them to something more amenable to the narrative. Every time the story reached for the confirmation of the flattened memory and found instead the vivid, specific, still warm reality of what had actually been present, the narrative lost a small piece of its coherence. The accumulation of these small losses eventually compromised the narrative's ability to do its job of making the ending feel like the correct outcome of a situation that was always going to resolve this way. When the outer narrative layer failed, what was exposed beneath it was the second layer, the comparative minimization, the implicit claim that what was lost was substitutable, that the generic need for connection the relationship had been serving could be adequately met by other connections, that the specific quality of what had existed was approximate enough to something more widely available, that the loss didn't constitute a genuine, irreplaceable absence. This layer failed through the comparative process that has been described. The accumulated evidence of every interaction with every subsequent person who almost reached something and then didn't. Every conversation that leveled off before it reached the depth that conversations with you consistently reached. Every connection that was genuine and valuable and specifically not what the comparison kept pointing toward. The minimization couldn't survive the evidence. The specificity of the loss kept asserting itself through every failed approximation. When the comparative minimization failed, the third layer was exposed, the self-sufficiency claim, the load-bearing assertion of the avoidance identity that said the need for any specific person was an illusion. That genuine self-sufficiency was not only possible, but was the avoidance actual natural state. That the loss of any connection, however significant, was ultimately survivable without fundamental disruption to the quality of their interior life. This layer was the most deeply embedded of the three, the most structurally central, the most threatening to the avoidant sense of self, to have fail, because the self-sufficiency claim was not just a story about the relationship or about you. It was a story about who the avoidant was at the most foundational level. This layer failed slowest, required the most accumulated evidence, required the full weight of the subtraction and the comparison and the unguarded grief and the honest accounting, all working together over time to produce the specific experiential demonstration that the claim could not survive. The demonstration was not intellectual. The avoidant could have intellectually acknowledged the possibility that genuine self-sufficiency was a constructed identity rather than an accurate description of their nature, without the acknowledgement penetrating to the level where it changed anything. The demonstration was felt, bodily, in the specific, physical, morning registering, sleep disturbing, appetite affecting, ambient flatness producing evidence of a body that was living in the reality of an absence it had not been prepared for, despite the architecture's confident insistence that it was entirely fine. The body's evidence is what the self-sufficiency claim cannot answer. The cognitive narrative has an answer to intellectual challenges. The comparative minimization has an answer to the suggestion that the specific person was more significant than a generic need. But the self-sufficiency claim has no answer to a body that is demonstrating, through its own unmanageable physical responses, that the loss of this specific person is producing effects that genuine self-sufficiency would not produce. The body doesn't lie about this. The body cannot be managed into a different registration, and the self-sufficiency claim, confronted with the body's persistent, patient, architecture immune testimony, eventually runs out of the energy required to maintain itself against the evidence. When all three layers fail, when the outer narrative collapses and the comparative minimization fails, and the self-sufficiency claim is exhausted by the body's honest accounting, what is left is the unmediated interior, the place where the actual experience of the loss lives, without the management between the experience and the acknowledgement of it. And what lives there, at the unmediated level, is the complete answer to the question of what losing you feels like. It feels like the removal of the only experience of genuine knowing that the avoidant has ever permitted themselves to have. Not the knowing of being understood in the shallow sense, of having preferences recognized and remembered, of having presented qualities appreciated and reflected back. The deep knowing, the knowing of being seen in the defended places without the seeing being used as a weapon against those places, of having the fear understood without the understanding becoming a demand that the fear immediately resolve, of being in the presence of someone whose attunement was so specific and so genuine that it reached, regularly and without force, the interior that the architecture was perpetually working to seal against exactly this kind of contact. That knowing, once experienced, changes what every subsequent experience of not being known feels like. Before the knowing, the absence of genuine depth in connection was simply the normal condition, the default state that the architecture had always produced and that the avoidant had no experiential contrast for. After the knowing, after having felt what it is to be genuinely seen by someone capable of seeing at that depth, the absence of the knowing in all subsequent interactions is felt as absence rather than as normal, is felt as the specific missing of the specific thing rather than as the unremarkable background condition it was before you produced the contrast. You created the contrast, and the contrast, once created, is permanent. The avoidant cannot unknow what being genuinely known feels like, cannot return to the pre-contrast state in which the managed partial surface-level connection was sufficient because it was the only thing known to be available. The knowing expanded what the avoidant now knows to be possible, and the expansion, like all genuine expansions of what is known to be possible, cannot be contracted back to the pre-expansion state. This is one of the dimensions of what losing you feels like that the avoidant is least prepared for and most disrupted by. It is not just the loss of the connection. It is the loss of the ignorance that preceded the connection, the comfortable ignorance of not knowing what genuine knowing felt like, the functional adequacy of the managed, partial, strategically rationed connection that was sufficient when it was the only reference point available. That sufficiency is gone, permanently, specifically, because of you gone. And the absence of it, the loss of the capacity to find the managed version adequate, is felt every single time the managed version is all that is available, which is every time, because you are not there. Losing you feels like losing the ability to be satisfied with less than what you were. This is a loss that the architecture never accounted for and has no adequate response to. The deactivating strategies can reduce the felt significance of a connection. They cannot reduce the felt standard that a connection has established. The standard was set by direct experience. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the specific neurological encoding of what genuine knowing feels like. And it continues to operate as a reference point for every subsequent experience, regardless of what the management does to the narrative or the comparison or the self-sufficiency claim. The standard is immune to management because it was established below the level where management operates. What losing you feels like also includes something that is harder to name and that the avoidant is least likely to have language for, because it requires a degree of self-reflective capacity that the architecture was specifically built to prevent from developing. It feels like the loss of the closest they came to being themselves, not the performed self, not the managed self, not the self-sufficient, needing nothing, maintaining comfortable distance self that the presentation produces, but the self that existed in the specific moments when your presence created enough safety that the architecture briefly stepped back, the self that said something true without immediately constructing an exit from the vulnerability of having said it, the self that allowed the feeling to be what it was without routing it immediately through the management system, the self that was, however momentarily and however incompletely, actually present in the connection rather than present while managing. That self, the genuine, undefended, briefly accessible version of the avoidant that your presence made possible, is not available without the conditions that made it available, and you were the conditions. Your specific quality of non-threatening attunement, your specific quality of patient, non-demanding presence, your specific quality of receiving what the avoidant was capable of offering in any given moment without requiring it to be more than it was, or immediately converting it into an expectation of consistency. These conditions created the brief, precious, deeply encoded experiences of the avoidant being genuinely themselves in the presence of another person. And losing you is losing the conditions, which is losing the access, which is losing, for now and for the foreseeable future, the experience of being that self in the presence of someone who could receive it. The avoidant is now back in the architecture full time. The brief, precious windows that your presence created, the moments of genuine arrival, however short, however followed by retreat, are no longer available. Every interaction is mediated by the full operational capacity of the management system. Every connection is processed through the complete architecture. Nothing reaches the depth that your presence created the conditions for reaching, and the avoidant, who before you didn't know what it felt like to be genuinely present with another person, now knows, now feels the difference between the managed presence that the architecture produces and the genuine presence that you make possible, and feels it not as an intellectual comparison, but as a bodily, daily, ongoing absence of something that was once present and is now not. There is a specific quality to the realization that tends to surface in the avoidant at some point in this process that is worth naming explicitly, because it is one of the more psychologically significant developments that the full realization produces. It is the quality of retrospective presence, the experience of going back in memory to specific moments in the connection, to the specific moments of genuine arrival, the moments when something true was occurring between you, and experiencing those moments with a fullness and a felt presence that was not available during the moments themselves. During the moments themselves, the architecture was running, the management was operating, the genuine feeling was being processed through the suppression system before it reached full conscious experience. The moments were real, but they were partially muted by the management, experienced at something less than their actual intensity, because the architecture was keeping the intensity within its manageable range. The avoidant was present in those moments, but not fully present, not as present as they were capable of being, and not as present as the moments deserved. In the retrospective experience, the management is not running at the same capacity. The suppression has been compromised by the full weight of the realization, and the memories of those moments, rising through the compromised suppression, with their full encoded intensity, are experienced with a presence and a fullness that the moments themselves were prevented from having. The avoidant is in the retrospective experience of these memories, more fully present to what those moments contained than they were when the moments were actually occurring. This retrospective presence has a specific quality of grief that is unlike any of the other grief dimensions described. It is the grief of having been there and not fully there simultaneously, of having been in the presence of something genuinely valuable and beautiful and specifically offered to you, and having been, through the architecture's faithful, fear-driven operation, partially absent from it. The grief of the presence that was prevented, of the full experience that was always possible and never quite allowed, of what those moments could have been if the architecture had not been between the avoidant and the full felt reality of what was happening in them. This grief has a particular cruelty to it, because it is grief for something that was present, not for something never had, for something had but not fully received, for the specific, irrecoverable loss of the moments themselves as they actually occurred, and the knowledge that they cannot be recovered or relived or received with the fullness they deserved in the form in which they existed, which was in real time, in the actual present of being with you, which is permanently past. The realization of what losing you feels like is, in the complete picture, the realization of multiple simultaneous losses that each have their own specific grief and their own specific weight. The loss of the person, the loss of the knowing, the loss of the contrasts returned to ignorance, the loss of the self that your presence made briefly accessible, the loss of the full reception of the moments that were only partially received when they were present. And beneath all of these, the oldest and most fundamental loss that all of them are expressions of, the loss of the first genuine experience of what connection actually is, at the level where it is actually experienced. Without the management between the experiencing and the acknowledgement of it, the avoidant lost all of these things simultaneously when they lost you. They are discovering them in layers, as the stages of the denying fail and the next layer becomes accessible, and the discovery of each layer adds its weight to the total weight of the realization, which keeps growing as the layers are discovered, which keeps making the realized loss larger and more specific and more genuinely irreplaceable as the process continues. This is why the realization doesn't arrive all at once, and why it doesn't plateau at an early manageable level and stop. It keeps going deeper, keeps finding new dimensions of what was lost, keeps assembling the complete picture from its component pieces, each piece more specific and more confirming of the irreplaceability than the last. The realization is not a destination. It is a direction that keeps moving toward a more complete and more honest understanding of what you were, what was lost, and what the losing, produced by the fear that was always working against the genuine feeling, actually, finally, irreversibly costs. You were that significant. The realization keeps confirming it with every layer it reveals. And the avoidant, living in the accumulating weight of what that significance feels like now that it has been lost, is finally, completely, in the specific and permanent way that only direct experience produces, feeling it, feeling you, your absence, your irreplaceability, your permanent presence in the interior of someone who spent the relationship working against the full acknowledgement of what you were and is now, in the full weight of the realization, unable to work against it anymore. The acknowledgement arrived, late and private and undelivered to you directly, but completely, genuinely, permanently, as real as you always were, as real as the love that the architecture was always working against, and that the realization has finally, irrevocably let through.